Greetings, fellow United pilots. I'm recording a video today that I did not anticipate recording, but I feel compelled to talk about something that I'm not seeing as this tentative agreement has been presented to us. We are here today because we have a tentative agreement that has not been adequately discussed from the MEC in a way that shows both the positives and negatives. There is nearly 17 hours and 21 minutes of video posted on the TA video link. And if you look through there, there's not a single video that was put together by someone who is part of the con camp. That is against policy manual, and it is against what I would say is fair representation of the pros and cons of this tentative agreement. The United Airlines MEC policy manual states in no uncertain terms, and I quote Article 11, Section 18, Paragraph D4, any explanatory video information shall be posted on the ALPA MEC website and advertised via email and MEC updates. And any video must fairly represent concerns of both the majority and the minority of the MEC as expressed in the respective pro and con statements and their rebuttals. And that goes back to March of 2012. If you go looking for this MEC's information on their website, they failed to do that. And if you think to yourself, well, maybe it's the responsibility of the con camp to put together a separate video, that's not what the policy manual says. Instead, the policy manual says that each video must contain both the pros and cons. And yet, if you sit down and watch some of these, just like I have, you will see that there is a slant that only pushes the positives of this agreement. And I'll get into some details on that in just a moment. There's a number of things and a number of reasons this TA should not have been brought to us. First and foremost, scope. We clearly said in our last survey that we are not going to give an inch on scope. That was not ambiguous, and that message was received by the MEC, and there's a reason we know that. It's because the MEC chair told us so. We said we're not going to give any scope. We're not going to give 1 pound. We're not going to give 1 seat. We're not going to give 1 aircraft. We're not going to give 1 mile of range. And while we're at it, we're also not going to give any joint venture, any code share, or foreign ownership. So that's something that we clearly stated. In fact, the MEC opening letter was exchanged with the company on the 1st of March 2018. And on the 13th of March, the MEC chair put out the following statement regarding scope. Our position is not noise, and it is not a feint or trial balloon, but rather a clear charge from our pilots that is being executed by your MEC leadership. So they got the word, but then they come with a tentative agreement where 15 of our 19 voting members agreed to give away scope. And it's something we simply won't do. We know that no rational pilot will ever vote to outsource his or her job. And it doesn't matter if you give me a 30% pay raise. It's not just about us, it's about the next generation. And that is clear. If we go to mediation and they start looking at other companies, I'd be happy to compare ourselves to Southwest Airlines, where they have no regional pilots. Every single passenger mile is flown by a mainline pilot. And that's how United Airlines should be. We also gave away scope when it came to Denver TK. We are allowing the camel's nose under the tent to outsource our jobs once again. We already have some non-seniority list pilots that teach some of our syllabus, but now we're allowing them to teach a much vaster expanse, not just the LTD, the A phase, which there are 4 sorties, but the FTDBs, those 4 sorties, as well as the full flight sims all the way up to the maneuvers valve. So again, another 4 simulators. And the reality is, if you make the job good enough, you compensate the folks, you're not going to have a problem recruiting quality instructors. But once again, this agreement should never have been brought to us, giving away our Denver TK scope. When it comes to retro, I think it's important to understand why retro. This agreement is extremely short-sighted in that we're only getting retro back to January of 2022, a mere 6.5 months. Let us be clear, we have been in negotiations now for 1,594 days. 1,594 days we exchanged opening letters. And here we are, there have been 1,258 days since we passed the amendable date on 31 January 2019. And instead of 1,258 days of retro, we're gonna get 6.5 months. It's unacceptable, and it's also not what you'd expect your negotiating team nor your MEC to negotiate on your behalf behind closed doors. They've been behind the cloak of non-disclosure agreements for quite some time. They've been negotiating behind closed doors for quite some time. And so we as United Pilots must trust that they're at least going to follow their policy manual. Their policy manual is not ambiguous. It says, and I will quote, retroactivity, Article 11, paragraph D9, section 20. Retroactivity, all future agreements between United Airlines and ALPA shall contain, not may, not should, shall contain retroactive application of any pay raises or retirement or benefit improvements back to the amendable date. And that's from January of 1989. It's in their policy manual, and when they're behind closed doors negotiating on our behalf, the least we could ask them to do is to follow their policy manual. They failed to do this. And just like Southwest Airlines, no retro, no deal. We are in a unique position right now. We have never had leverage like we have now. That comes directly from the head of ALPA National. What happens if we say no? Don't buy into the fear. Delta Airlines had this exact same thing happen when they were brought a substandard agreement where management tried to take their 270 hours of sick leave back in the summer of 2015. In TA15, they voted that down, 65%. Membership ratification clearly spoke and said you won't take our sick leave, and the 8% pay raise is not nearly enough. At that point, they went back to the bargaining table. Their amenable date of December of 2015 passed, and then in December of 2016, they voted for TA2. It passed membership ratification 82%, and with that, they got full retro back to the amenable date, and they went from 8% pay raise to 18.5% pay raise. The power of no when you have leverage is amazing. Use it. Southwest Airlines, they did the same thing. In fact, they always do this. No retro, no deal. Southwest Airlines had an amenable date of August 2012. 3 years later, they came to an agreement, but it was substandard. They voted it down. TA1 went down 61.4%. At that point, the SWAPA president resigned. They got a new MEC and went back to work. A year later, in November of 2016, TA2 came along, and they voted that in via membership ratification, 84%. They got 4 years of full retro. This is important for more than the simple reason that your time is worth money, not just now, but the entirety of the amenable date. It's important because, and I'll give you an anecdote. I was at a Council 11 meeting in person a few weeks ago, and there was a gentleman sitting next to me who has 10 months until retirement. He leaned over and said, "I'm voting no." And I was impressed because a lot of folks that are getting near retirement think to themselves, I've only seen about 1 or 2 contracts every decade, and I might need to vote yes just to get something. He said it didn't bring enough value. And I asked if I could use his name when I later got up and spoke at that meeting. And I'm not going to use his name today. But that is why we fight for retro. Southwest Airlines, when they got retro, They didn't just give retro to people on the property. They gave retro to all retirees. They also gave retro to anyone who has since left the property, and they also gave retro to the families of deceased. Those reasons are why we expect retro, and why any deal going forward must include full retro back to the amenable date of 31 January 2019. If you don't demand retro, there is absolutely no penalty for a company dragging its feet. 1,594 days ago, we started negotiations. It's unacceptable that we don't have a contract until now, and it's even more unacceptable that the contract we have in front of us has so many deficiencies, it will go down. My intent is not to garner more no votes prior to this closeout. This contract will clearly fail. And I think it's going to fail worse than 62%. I think it's going to fail worse than 65%. Fully, maybe 2/3 of our pilots will say this is not enough. Maybe it'll go further. 3/4, 75% of our pilots may say this does not meet the standard. And when that happens, we're going to allow change to take place, and there's a process. We're going to go through it unemotionally, step by step, so that we can get the correct representation, so we can get a great follow-on contract. This contract was supposed to be the quality of life contract. We were supposed to get all the improvements. That's why we were told, even though the heat map was largely green in 2019, during a year of record profits for not just the industry, but United Airlines. And yet when we looked at it, it looks like the contract of concessions. There is absolutely no reason reserves now need to check their schedule on a day off. There is no reason that a commuting reserve like I was last summer in Newark in Council 5, where I have to now fly up the night prior because I can be assigned as early as 0500 report on my first day of reserve. It was never about the money, and yet it became about the money. We wanted quality of life, and instead they gave us about 8 different types of ad pay when they could reassign us and continue the status quo of unpredictability. We wanted predictability, and what we got was a lot of, well, we don't think the company will XYZ. That is not what we expect in a contract. What we expect in a contract is this language prevents the company from A, B, C. Our line holders, we hold seniority dear. If you have the seniority to fly, in my case, I'm a 7.5 pilot. If I have the ability via seniority to hold 764 wide body flying position to Hawaii, I should be able to go to Hawaii in the flying position. I should not be able to be reassigned without a major event. And this contract takes away some of those protections. This wasn't adequately represented in the pros and cons. It was almost an aside. And when there was immediate revolt, if you will, with folks saying, we don't like this, our MEC met that with disdain and condescension. Instead, what we got was, you don't understand, if you just read the contract, you'll see why this is good. We are the folks who put those men and women in the room to negotiate on our behalf. It is our concerns that they need to represent, not the other way around, where they tell us what we should think about an agreement. We hold line holder scheduling dear. They took away, they made it easier to reassign us, and then gaslighted us with a MEC comm saying it is no easier now to reassign a line holder. That's simply not true. In fact, it is demonstrably false. Paragraph 20I5 used to have protections before we got to step 5, which was line holder reassignment in a short notice sick call type of environment. And they had to go through steps 3 and 4 for that untriggered reassignment, to where you had to use, number 1, a reserve. You must use a reserve, not may, and then you must go through the premium process before you go to an untriggered reassignment for a line holder. Just this very month, I got 20 F1'd, if you will, if you want to use that as a verb, where I had bid flying position to Sao Paulo, and then just via a change in flying, I'm a line holder holding wide body flying. I got reassigned my entire month, all 3 trips, to unaugmented all-night flying to Dublin. That should not be as easy as it is today, and we made it easier in the next contract. We're not going to variabilize our labor. We're not going to give away what we used to have. The line credit ceilings used to be in the 80s, 84, then 86 hours. Now it's 90 hours. And now the company wants to take us to 91 hours for a credit ceiling. Again, you're simply outsourcing your jobs, because if they had enough people on the property, a rising tide lifts all boats, and we would have more people to do the job. Your quality of life would go up, and they're not going to work you as hard in those summer months. And it's important that we stand up for that, because this is the time we have leverage. This is the time we have leverage for retro. This is the time we have leverage for scope. If you're giving away scope at a time like this, you need to reconsider why. There were a number of things in the pro-con statements that were illuminatory. I will say that when I read the pro statement for the first time since I've been on the property, it was unsigned. That is unprecedented that the 15 of the 19 members who voted for this contract weren't willing to put their name on the pro letter. And then the con letter clearly laid out why this agreement was substandard, and they signed it. That's important. It's important to realize, because there needs to be accountability for this. There were a number of half-truths. Again, whether they followed their policy manual or not. For example, scope. One of the very first things I opened the morning the TA dropped, that Friday morning at about 9:35 a.m., when I opened up the website, the first thing I opened was the contract reference guide. On the very second slide, the first slide was a nice color UPA2022. Slide 2 was the first place that it had words. And on the second bullet of that slide, it said, "We preserved scope protections." Is that true? Or is it demonstrably false? Did they give away 4,750 pounds to a product by its very nature and existence was designed to circumvent the 70 and 76 seat protections we have in the UPA right now? We're limited to 255 of those aircraft. That jet was designed to get around those numbers. And now the company comes to ask us for scope relief on a plane that shouldn't even be on our property? No, it won't happen. It should not have been brought to us, and we're going to fix that on the next try. It's in their policy manual. Just ask them to follow their policy manual. The other half-truths are many. The retro portion, again, 6.5 months as compared to 1,258 days since the amenable date. The way they advertised the pay raises, they said it was 14.6% pay raises in exchange for this UPA. No, it's actually 9.2% pay raises in exchange for this UPA. Because if we do nothing but sit on our hands, we're going to get 5% when the company returns to 4 quarters of profitability. I mentioned the preserving scope protection. Pay raises that exceed Delta Airlines. Sure, if you want to compare 2020 and 23 and 24 pay rates to Delta's 2018 pay rates, they're in negotiations too, and surely they're going to get more than $1 per hour raises, which will then put them and vault them far above ours. There was a rush to get this contract out in front of your eyes and voted upon, and it shouldn't have been that way. We've been in contract negotiations 1,600 days, and there was a reason we had to rush to get this thing done by July 15th. You know what happens on the 21st? That's when our CEO reports earnings. It will be a record quarter. So much so that the previous record quarter, Q2 2019, it will exceed that. The initial estimate was TRASM will go up 17%. They later revised that guidance and said TRASM will now go up a record 23 to 25% over the record Q2. But they didn't want you to put your eyes on those earnings prior to closing this vote. This was brought up, and it was decided to close the vote prior to earnings. That is tragic, and it is not the way you need to be represented. The way that the Zoom process has worked, didn't work out well for pandemic reasons. We saw how the pandemic LOA was put out via Zoom. There were some pretty good reasons to do that. We weren't even traveling yet, so we had to resort to Zoom. This was not the case. This was a time when some of your LEC members pleaded with the MEC to do in-person road shows, and instead of what we got was 17 hours and 21 minutes of negotiators and SMEs talking behind PowerPoint. If you don't learn well from PowerPoint like I don't, then you should have had the opportunity to look your MEC and negotiators in the eye and get a face-to-face back and forth about this TA. That was not the way this should have gone down. There are so many other things that are half-truths, such as there was a video on the TA website it was the one that's an hour and 27 minutes. And one of the negotiators actually talked about the new landing pay. Hey, you get $500, you get $500, you get $500. It looked like an Oprah Winfrey show. And at the end of it, it was stated, hey, there are some downsides to opting out, so I recommend you go read the contract before you vote. Remember the policy manual about fairly representing the concerns of the pro and con camp in every video? It's not the con side's job to put out another video to counter that narrative. You should never have a negotiator tell you that you get $500 if you opt in, but if you opt out, go read the contract. Because here's the fine print. As an IRO, which I often am, I might lose pay for 60 days for myself and my family because I opted out. It is not accurate and it is not honest to portray that massive rule change by telling me to go reference the contract prior to voting. I do appreciate what Council 12 just did with these type of answers. Frequently asked questions. You get them in your email container at 5 p.m. and you open it up and it says, does it make it easier to reassign a line holder? And the first word, no. We talked about why that isn't true. Council 12 said they give that to Pinocchios. It goes on, and I'm not going to dwell on that, but there is a reason there was immediate discontent. It was overwhelming. And now where we stand is having the ability to start with a clean slate. It is imperative that we do not let the negotiators go back in that room, and we don't let the MEC chair talk directly to the CEO to see if we can save this, sprinkle some extra candy on the stale donut, and try to make something and get a 51% yes vote. That would be tragic. Tragic of uncalculable proportions. Instead, what we must do is ask ourselves the tough questions. Are you fairly represented right now? Does it make sense that the people in those rooms have been on full-time flight pay loss for a decade or two? Have they flown on the line enough to know how onerous it is to be reassigned as a line holder time after time? Or like I was a wide-body global reserve last summer in Newark, it was very difficult to say the least. This is why we need representation. And we need to follow the process. The process is simple. If you think that we're going to get a new negotiating team with the enthusiastic 15 yes voters that are still in their chairs, you have another thing coming. You have an opportunity at this point, once this TA fails, to go back and ask if these are the correct people to represent you. I'm not advocating they're not. You get to do that at your base. But what I am saying is that if you think this will change without changing the 15, you're sorely mistaken. Keeping the same exact thing and doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is the true definition of insanity. After those recalls, which I've already seen some resolutions that are going to take place, we now have an opportunity to get a slate of MEC that represents our needs. And lastly, we can then, with polling, send a new negotiating team back into the room to get a agreement worthy that now we can stay and stamp this is an industry leading contract. Again, the reason I'm here is unplanned. I did not anticipate providing this message, but I could no longer idly stand by. If we stay unified and move forward, unemotionally, but with the guard rails in place to get a better agreement, a rising tide will lift all boats, and sometime this in a future time next year, we will get a better contract, and then we can vote and get these type of numbers because the agreement doesn't need to be sold. Thank you for your time.